Hi everyone, and welcome to the Sustainability Virtual Stage. I'm Emily Cook, and I will be your stage host for today. We have some great sessions coming up, so I'm excited to kick things off. To start us off today on the virtual stage, we have some amazing speakers who are joining us from Achilles to give their presentation on sustainable procurement, the road to an ethical and efficient net zero supply chain. So, joining us from Achilles is Katie Tamblin, who is Chief Product Officer, as well as Mike Tournier, who is their Carbon Reduction SME. As Chief Product Officer, Katie leads the product team in developing innovative and exciting products that deliver market-leading supplier assurance, leveraging supply chain insights. The product team is dedicated to enabling the pursuit of sustainable, ethical, and efficient supply chains for customers and facilities, the efficient transfer of knowledge throughout supply chains. Mike has been the Executive Director of the Carbon Market Institute, the Australian peak industry body for carbon professionals, and has worked as General Manager Global Operations for one of the world's largest and most successful carbon developers. He has also been a board member of the International Carbon Reduction and Offset Alliance and has worked for some of the largest UK carbon neutral businesses. So I'm excited. Please welcome Katie and Mike to the stage for their presentation.
Thanks so much, Emily. We really appreciate your having us here today.
Thanks, Emily. Love to be here.
First, I want to introduce Achilles. We're going to talk about sustainable procurement and ethical and efficient net zero supply chains. But before we kick off, I'll go through a quick introduction just for anyone who's not familiar with Achilles. We have been in this business for 30 years. We collect, validate, and maintain essential supplier data through online questionnaires and physical audits. So the carbon programs that we run are really a portion of the broader supplier assurance that we provide. And we're going to talk a little bit about that broader assurance and then how important it is to strive for net zero within that context. We work traditionally across more than 11 sectors with over 550 buyers worldwide. And we've assured over 175,000 suppliers to date. And we assure them across our 5 pillars of sustainability. So we look at environmental sustainability, social and governance factors, the very popular at the moment, ESG elements, but we also look at sustainability through the lens of financial health and economic growth, and also health and safety. A number of organizations put health and safety within the social element, which in many industries makes sense. But given our rich history of assuring suppliers safety track records for very risky industries like construction, extraction, and heavy manufacturing, we assess those elements separately. And we really believe it's important to look at all 5 pillars of sustainability when you're looking at improving our impact on the planet, on our communities, on health worldwide. And so if we think about those 3 elements, we will look next at people, planet, and profit on the next slide to see how our assessments against sustainability align to emerging business goals. It's important to look not just in a silo at emissions alone, because we can see that these issues are global, they're complex, and they often represent elements of compromise in supply chain decisions. So by that, I mean, if you were to only choose a supplying organization or a business partner based on their performance in the emissions arena, you might be missing out on their wider impact on the planet, or you might be missing out on their wider impact on people. So as an example, we see that electric vehicle demand has shot through the roof, which is absolutely fantastic, has a wonderful positive impact on emissions, or the potential to have huge positive impacts on emissions globally. But equally, there are challenges for budgets associated with electric vehicle production, as we have seen with economic changes and increased costs of nickel and other elements that go into the manufacturing of electric vehicles. And we've also seen negative social impacts of the electric vehicle trend. Sometimes workers not being treated as they should in the effort to produce high volumes of electric vehicles at in a very short time window. So I say all of that just to provide some context so that when you think about how important it is to strive for net zero, that you also understand how it sits within the broader context of sustainability. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Mike, who's going to talk about how you can pursue net zero in your supply chain.
Thanks, Katie. So Achilles has been delivering here in the UK, the UK's only internationally accredited greenhouse gas certification scheme. We've been doing it for some 14 years now. So before we drill down into the nuances of trying to measure and manage carbon through your supply chain, it'd be helpful just to retouch on the basics. Why are we doing this? It's really around greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide is the most common one, but there are a number of other greenhouse gases which over the last couple of 100 years, particularly following the Industrial Revolution, we as human beings have been pumping a lot of these greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. They build up over time and they create what's called the greenhouse gas effect. And that results in a year-on-year increase in ambient temperature. And if you increase ambient temperature, then that leads to more extreme weather events. And we've just been experiencing that 2 heat waves in the UK here in as little as 6 weeks. And that creates more extreme weather events. Often it's too much water where you don't need it, not enough where you do. And that impacts on societies and economies right down to individual levels. And this is one of the key reasons why governments around the world have been setting targets to achieve net zero. Now, some time frames are relatively short. Fundamentally, if we go, the amount of carbon dioxide that it can reasonably hold is almost full, almost overflowing the bucket. It's something called the tipping point, which is trying to reduce that increase in ambient year-on-year temperature to not more than 1.5 degrees above 1990 levels. And there have been some efforts around creating carbon sinks and removals to try and lower the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, but in reality, that carbon cycle is measured over hundreds of years. So these sorts of initiatives aren't going to get us where we need to be. And that's why everyone's looking at drastically cutting the amount of emissions being released to the atmosphere. And that ostensibly is what net zero is about. It's staying within this 1.5 degree tipping point and reducing the amount of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases being released and accumulating in the atmosphere. So how do we get there? This is a big question. And one of the reasons why a lot of businesses often struggle to start the journey. And by when? So here in the UK, the government has set a target of net zero emissions by 2050. Scotland has 2045. And yet other industry sectors have setting net zero targets well ahead of this, some 20 to 25 years ahead of that. And that creates a lot of challenges for procurement professionals and environmental professionals alike. So getting started, there are accepted 4 broad strategies to a successful decarbonisation strategy. First one is obviously measuring. You can't manage what you haven't measured. So measure and report your climate and environmental impacts. Set targets for reducing those emissions, developing route maps to reach net zero, and incentivizing the organisation and the individuals within that to reduce those emissions. So they generally have some skin in the game. Now, how do you measure? There are 2 key accounting protocols that are in use for greenhouse gas reporting and measuring. One is the World Resources Institute Greenhouse Gas Accounting Protocol, and the other is the ISO standard 14064 Part 1, the 2018 version, which allows for full value chain reporting. Effectively, one tells you what and why you should measure, and the other tells you how. And by using both together, you as an organisation can be assured you're going to meet or exceed best practice here in the UK and anywhere else in the world. Now, what's measured? For many of you, You have seen this classic slide from the Greenhouse Gas Accounting Protocol. There are three sources. Scope 1 is the direct emissions in the middle from your business activities, whether it's your fleet, the heating of your offices, your manufacturing processes, if you're releasing fugitive emissions. Scope 2 is indirect emissions, and here again in the UK, that's primarily importing electricity to run your operation. And then we've got Scope 3, which is a much broader animal. It's 15 subcategories put into two elements. One is upstream, everything coming into your business, and downstream, everything going out of your business. And within these Scope 3s, there's some good news straight away. There are some there that you actually have the ability to influence and control over more so than some of the others. And they're things simply as waste to landfill. You can control how much waste goes to landfill or where it goes elsewhere. Business travel, and particularly downstream transport and distribution. Organisations tend to have a lot more control over that. But measuring all of the Scope 3s is becoming more and more important. And fundamentally, that's because within an organisation's operational footprint, Scope 3s can be 80% or even up to 95% of the total greenhouse gas emissions from your operations. And that's why the focus is on Scope 3s. And a lot of the reasons because of changes in regulatory policy, corporates and sectors setting net zero targets. There's also the issue around managing your brand and reputational risks. For those, particularly those who are listed, institutional investors are taking a view on whether an organisation represents a good long-term investment. Are they managing climate change risk and carbon efficiency? And then you've got a number of voluntary and regulatory compliance reporting requirements that are now coming into play, where businesses are being asked to identify what their Scope 3s are and report on those and reduce them. So why is it so important with Scope 3? Well, it's often said that your Scope 3 is someone else's Scope 1 and 2. That's quite a simplified way to look at it, but it is such fertile ground for opportunities to identify synergies, to collaborate, to look at alternative low carbon solutions within a supply chain that wouldn't otherwise be addressed if they weren't created as part of a focal point. And that's why Scope 3s are really one of the areas that businesses are wanting to move on much more. It is, however, without a doubt, one of the most complex areas and challenging to measure and report. So where do you start? And as a certifier in greenhouse gas assertions, we often see businesses are saying, we want to do it, we just don't know how to get started. And the simple answer is one bite at a time. Right? There are, as I mentioned before, 15 subcategories of Scope 3. In an ideal world, it'd be wonderful to get primary data, activity data for each of these categories, but often that's not the case. It's just not possible. So within this data hierarchy, you can see the color coded from red at the bottom, which is not great, but it's a good starting point, to green at the top, which would be primary data. It's okay to start by using a spend-based approach. And that's often, particularly with things like from procurement side, purchase goods and services, where a lot of business will start to really drill down into the supply chain and do some screening, identify where there are opportunities to decarbonate. Achilles delivers the Carbon Reduce program, which is a step-by-step process to allow businesses to measure, manage, and report their carbon liabilities across all their scopes, including Scope 3. And we've got a success pathway roadmap. It's a process that takes businesses through a step-by-step process to help them manage that. But anyone using a logical approach can get there. The first one is, don't be overwhelmed by imperfect data. That practically is where everyone is at right now. It's often seen as one of the key barriers to stopping people trying to measure and manage their Scope 3 emissions. And within this data hierarchy, you can start off with just using a spend-based approach. From procurement base, you can look what you're spending on, what's the currency, and what type of goods and services, and start to calculate the carbon intensity of that. And that will enable you to do some mapping, identify where those hotspots are, and hopefully be able to move up this data hierarchy to more a hybrid approach, or even primary data, asking your key suppliers who represent the largest carbon liability what they're doing around carbon, able to provide more accurate information for you. And often you'll find that they've got that information at hand, they just haven't been asked for it before. We've got tools that also help with this. There is complexities around trying to measure spend-based approach. We've got some tools that break spend-based down into 146 subcategory. You can choose to do that whether in US or pound sterling, and calculate emission intensity of your supply chain. It also is able to run reports so that you can get real optics on against all your 15 subcategories if you wish to measure all those, the carbon intensity of that, and year-on-year comparisons, so you can actually see what's happening. You can actually even track that down to a quarterly and monthly basis. The other very powerful enabler is linking everything back to the this goal of net zero and the 1.5 degrees. So we also have some really helpful tools for businesses to be able to plot their emission reduction activities against a 1.5 and a 2 degree pathway and see how things are tracking. And this is a powerful enabler when working with your tier ones and tier twos to help them visualize how things are progressing, where there are opportunities to decarbonate, and so that everyone is on that journey together. So, word of caution, before you rush off and request that your tier ones, tier twos, even your tier threes start measuring and reporting carbon, get your own house in order first. Start with a position of credibility. Walk the talk, show some leadership in this area. You'll get a lot better engagement because you can demonstrate that managing carbon efficiency and climate change risk is important to you, and therefore it's important to them as well if they want to continue to be part of your supply chain. Just by way of example, the business case, why it makes sense to do this. One of our long-term clients within Achilles Carbon Reduce program is Anglian Water Services, one of the largest utility water providers in the UK. Quick takeaway, they've been with the program well over 10 years. They've been able to, through the program, reduce operational carbon by 34%, capital carbon by 63%. And if you monetize that, the savings is in order of 2 million sterling per annum. So it makes business sense as well, because if you can reduce your operating carbon, you reduce your operating costs, and that's money that falls to the bottom line. So in summary, key things about delivering against a net zero strategy, it does require strong leadership for a transformational change. It's vital you align your business value and expectations and drivers to underwrite that journey. Walk the talk first before you ask others to do the same. It seems such a simple thing, but you can't manage what you haven't measured. So get in place a really deep understanding of your own and your supply chain carbon liabilities is a key to success. Along with that, the other critical enablers is really around stakeholder engagement. Work with your tier ones and your tier twos to educate, inform, collaborate. You may also have to do some upskilling for them. You're developing, in a lot of cases, new languages, so everyone's on the same page and they can take that journey with you. And finally, it's not a journey you can do in isolation. So share the learnings, share the outcomes where decarbonation is, work across your industry and your sectors to drive decarbonation, lobby for further support, and create that new normal. And we're seeing that here in the UK, particularly within the construction industry, are setting targets around 2025 and 2030 for a net zero future. That's had a significant social change in their tier ones and tier twos who are rapidly getting on board with this. So it does work, and we'd be happy to have a conversation with you about how we can help with your own journey. Thank you. Emily.
And now are we passing it over to Katie now to finish off the presentation?
No, I think we can go straight to Q&A if you'd like to, Emily.
Perfect. Let's get it going. So, from a few kind of key pointaways that you kind of mentioned there, Mike, you mentioned at the start that businesses often struggle to kind of start their journey of net zero. Of course, it's no easy feat, and obviously the best place you said to get started is to measure. When you shared some resources to do so, which was fantastic. Kind of the first question I wanted to ask is, how do you effectively measure these things, especially when some of the factors in sustainability can be incredibly complex? I know you kind of mentioned them 15 touch points there. Solar panels are a great example for lowering the emissions associated with electricity productions, but obviously there are concerns about the labour and the supply chain processes with that. So how do you kind of manage these complex issues?
Sure. Achilles each year runs a sustainability survey, and the most recent one that was published, 75% of respondents, and there's nearly 2,500 respondents, said, look, managing carbon efficiency is super important to them, but only half had even made the journey or started it. And one of the reasons is often it's just overwhelming. There's too much information, too much data, and the key is to cut through that. And the simplest thing is do something called strategic intent. You look at those 15 subcategories, look at which ones are important and relevant for you, and then don't sweat it if you haven't got primary data. Do a spend-based approach, because that'll identify the hot spots. You better say, well, of this 20 of my supply chain, here's my top 20% with the largest carbon impact. That's what you need to focus on, right? Because it is like eating an elephant. It is one bite at a time. And that's the most pragmatic step-by-step way to do that.
Yeah, and I think as well, this is a long process. This is a lengthy thing, and it's hard to get started. But once you're kind of in the rhythm of things, you will face some challenges. Obviously, there's no doubt. I'm sure that a lot of what we're going to talk about at today's conference is going to be how we overcome those challenges. So I kind of wanted to ask, what was the biggest obstacle when it comes to measuring and reporting carbon, especially throughout your supply chain?
Probably the biggest one is demystifying it. I think everyone's the talk about climate change is front of mind. We're seeing it in newspapers every week here in the UK. There's a lot of goodwill. People want to change. We've got a new normal. And the same can apply to transformational change in carbon. It's just how do you start that journey and why it's important. And in terms of your supply chain, it's also having them understand that sustainability, as Katie put it, in the broader context. Carbon's just one element of ESG, and it creates, by managing it, it creates resilient businesses. So whilst these decisions are medium to long term, the outcomes, decisions made today are so much more relevant. And if you can help your supply chain to be more carbon efficient, that's more money to their bottom line, and we end up with more sustainable, financially sustainable businesses and a better planet.
Yeah, and I mean, right at the start of the presentation, you kind of mentioned people, purpose, and planet. So kind of wanting to zoom in a little bit on the people part of our supply chain. Let's say that I am someone who deals with over 2,000 suppliers, and I want to know how exactly I go about prioritizing this list, and who do I focus on with supporting them. So do you have any tips, and how exactly would I go about that?
Well, I think, and I'll let Mike jump in on this one too, because I'm sure he has very good practical tips. But I think the first place, it goes back to the point that Mike made, you can't manage what you haven't measured. So the first thing is to assess those suppliers. And that could just be looking at your spend-based analysis that Mike described, and looking at which suppliers of those thousands where could you have the biggest impact. Based on what we know about emissions and sustainability as a whole, where are the largest gains to be had? And often traditionally in supply chain management, people would call that, where are your biggest risks? And in the context of emissions, it would be, where are likely the biggest emissions coming from in your supply chain, and start there where you can have a large impact. So Mike, I don't know if there's anything else you'd add to that.
No, that's 100% right, Katie. It's really much around supply chain mapping, identify those hotspots. It's the 80-20 rule. Yeah. 20% focus will give you 80% of your results.
Yeah, and a bit of a follow on from that, I guess, as well as like looking at your opportunities rather than, focusing too much on the risk. So is there opportunities now that these topics are kind of coming into the limelight, that this is a huge focus for businesses now? I mean, Katie, I hope you don't mind me throwing this at you. Is there opportunities that organizations are heavily focusing on now?
Yes, absolutely. And I think, we're seeing a lot of legislation and regulation come across Europe, not just related to emissions, but overall ESG, both from a reporting perspective, from a knowing your supply chain perspective. That's becoming much, much more common in the regulation. We've got the Norwegian Transparency Act that became effective just a couple months ago. We've got the German Supply Chain Act coming in January. I think the key things I would say are, that you really need to understand who are the players and what are the impacts, and then think about it from their perspective. So what I would recommend businesses do is don't reinvent the wheel. Don't come up with your own way of measuring and your own thing, set of data you want suppliers to submit, or base it off of what they're already doing. And that goes back to Mike's point that if everybody started reporting their own emissions, your scope 3 would be covered. So, I think what I would say, the best way to keep this as efficient as possible as we try to get started is be flexible and let people share with you what they've done. So that that's a great place to start, and then you can work on a common standard, working off of internationally accepted principles and data. Because what you don't want to do is send a scope 3 questionnaire to all your suppliers that looks kind of different from what they were reporting on their own and kind of different from what they got from 25 other buyers, and then it becomes a very inefficient system. So I think that's the core thing that I would recommend, is just try to focus on what's the ground that's already been laid and just starting on reporting on what you've got.
Yeah, and a huge focus as well, and today's conference is kind of collaboration and how this sustainability journey is not an individual path. A lot of organizations are coming together and partnering, and they're talking with governments, and they're opening this conversation obviously on a global level, especially with the breadth that supply chains can be nowadays. So I wasn't sure if you wanted to kind of speak a little bit about your partners and how important it is that collaboration is key to kind of pushing this forward.
Absolutely. Mike, do you want to start with that, and I'll jump in after you?
Yeah, I think it's the analogy, we're all in the same boat, and there's a lot of goodwill here. It's just people often still struggle to say, well, how do I do it? And that's, I think, where Achilles and their solutions come into play, to not only empower people, educate them, and start them on that journey. And it's sort of around managing this good data that creates good outcomes.
Yeah, and I think the partners that we work with. So we partner with Toy2 to Mike showed a screenshot of their eManage software that helps you measure all of these things and helps you manage it over time. We also partner with Build UK, so we can store common questionnaires and common content. And I think the key thing, working with this network of partners across industries, a number of industry organizations, working with government, working with partners that are specialists in the field, is to bring all of that together so that we can maximize our network effect. And what I mean by that is, if you can get all of this reporting into one place, then everything runs more efficiently. And it goes back to the previous point I was making about just collecting what's already there and don't do it in a different way than what's already being done. So one of the biggest benefits suppliers see as they report scope 3 is if they can do it as part of their Achilles assessment, which already touches on a lot of those other elements, then it's just much easier for them. They're not having to extract it and send it over here, upload it to some other portal, or do it some different way. And by bringing this network of partners together, then everyone we work with, purchasing organizations, industry associations, governments, nonprofit organizations, they can all access that information in a common data set. I think that's the key thing. And that's the benefit of having this really strong partner network in place.
Fantastic. I think that kind of wraps us up perfectly. That is all we have time for your session today on the virtual stage. But I want to thank you both. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Katie, for joining us here at Sustainability Live London on the virtual stage. I would say stick around. Anyone who's watching, we have some more amazing speakers lined up. So make sure you stay tuned, and I'll see you all shortly.